I want you to imagine sitting at a dinner table, the fanciest restaurant in your city, surrounded by people who think they're better than you. Lawyers, judges, people with titles, and your own wife seated you at the far end, told you to keep your mouth shut, and introduced you like you were something she had to apologize for. Now imagine one man stands up, walks around that entire table, stops in front of you, and says something so quiet and so powerful that every single person stops breathing. He looked at me and said, "Do they know who you really are?" My wife's face went white, and everything she thought she knew about our 18-year marriage, every assumption, every condescension, every quiet little embarrassment she'd built her identity around, started to fall apart right there over the breadbasket. This is that story.
My name is Mike, and I want to start by telling you what I look like to most people. I'm not a tall guy, not flashy. I drive a Ford F-250, dark blue, some rust on the passenger door, and I wear the same 2 pairs of jeans on rotation. I don't own a lot of suits. I don't talk about myself much. Never have. If you saw me at a gas station or a hardware store, you'd probably look right through me. That's not me being hard on myself. That's just the truth. I've spent a lot of years cultivating that invisibility on purpose, and I'll explain why in a minute. I grew up in rural Virginia, Buckingham County. My dad worked a lumberyard. My mom cleaned houses part-time and raised 3 kids with the other half of herself. We didn't have much, but we didn't go without anything that mattered. My dad had this saying, "The people doing the real work are the ones you never notice." I didn't really understand that until I was about 35. Now I think about it almost every day. I met Sandra at a cookout in the summer of 2005. She was 26, finishing her graduate degree in education policy, and she was the most self-assured woman I had ever talked to in my life. Not arrogant, just certain. She knew who she was, and she wasn't embarrassed about any of it. I found that mesmerizing. We were engaged within 2 years. For the first several years, we were good, really good. She got a position with the county school board. I was building out my property management business, which at that point was small, maybe 30 residential units, a few commercial spaces. Nothing impressive on paper. But I worked hard and I reinvested everything I earned. Every dollar. No vacations, no boats, no ego purchases. Just work and patience. Sandra climbed fast professionally. She got connected to Richmond's donor class, charity galas, foundation boards, that kind of thing. And slowly, almost without me noticing it at first, a gap opened up between us. Not an affection exactly, more like in the way she saw the world. And in the way she saw me, that I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to think Sandra was a villain from the beginning. She wasn't. People change. Environments shape them. And the environment she was increasingly living in, private school fundraisers, county commission dinners, a social circle made up almost entirely of lawyers and academics, was telling her constantly, through 1,000 small signals, that certain kinds of people were worth knowing and certain kinds weren't. I was starting to fall into the second category. The first time I really noticed it, was at a neighborhood cocktail party maybe 8 years into our marriage. I was talking to a guy named Dennis, who had just come back from a vacation in Italy, and I mentioned that I'd been looking at some commercial real estate in the Northside District. Sandra walked over mid-sentence, put her hand on my arm, and said, "Sorry, Mike talks about work at everything. Dennis, how was Tuscany?" And she just redirected the whole conversation. Like I wasn't there. Dennis looked a little uncomfortable. I took a sip of my drink and stepped back. On the drive home, I brought it up. She said I was being sensitive. She said Dennis wasn't interested in property management, and she was just trying to keep the conversation flowing. And I let it go, because at that point I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt. But it kept happening. At her school board colleague's retirement dinner, she introduced me to her supervisor as my husband. He manages some rental properties. Not wrong, technically, but there was something in the wordsome that didn't sit right. At her sister's wedding, she put me at the table with the younger cousins because, as she explained it, you don't know anyone there anyway, and you never really talk at these things. Which was also technically true. But it had started to feel like the quiet I kept at social events wasn't something I was doing. It was something she was engineering. She managed where I sat, who I talked to, how I was introduced. And over time, I stopped pushing back because the conversations that followed were always exhausting in the same way. I was always too sensitive, always misreading things, always making it about me. I want to tell you what I was actually doing during those years because it matters to be why the time we'd been married 15 years, the property management company I started with 30 units had grown quietly into something I don't say out loud very often in social settings. We owned or managed just under 400 residential units across 3 counties, 2 commercial strips, a storage facility complex, and I had recently closed on a partial stake in a regional logistics warehouse that was doing very well. I didn't talk about it for a few reasons. 1, I learned early that money changes how people treat you, and not always in ways you want. 2, and this is harder to admit, I had watched Sandra's world closely enough to understand that the people in it were exactly the kind of people who would want something from you the moment they knew what you had. I preferred being underestimated. It had served me well in business for years. But the third reason? I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I was waiting to see whether Sandra loved the man in the rust-spotted truck, or whether she needed him to become something else before she could be proud of him. I was getting my answer slowly, and it wasn't the one I'd hoped for. She started keeping a mental list of my embarrassments. I could feel it. The time I didn't know the name of a local alderman at her colleague's dinner. The time I wore the wrong jacket to a fundraiser. The time I mentioned fixing a leaky pipe in one of my properties and the woman across the table asked if I was a plumber and Sandra laughed a little too quickly and said something like that. Something like that. That was the sentence that sat in my stomach for 3 weeks. And then came a Saturday afternoon phone call that started this whole thing. Her brother Garrett, good guy, I like Garrett, was engaged to a woman named Priya. Priya's father, Dr. Ashok Reddy, was a federal judge. Circuit court. Well respected. They were all having dinner that Saturday at Treviso, which at the time was probably the finest restaurant in Richmond, the kind of place with a wine list that comes in a leather book and the waiters don't write anything down. Sandra called me at 1:30 in the afternoon. She had one instruction. Keep your mouth shut. Don't embarrass us like you always do. She told me to wear the navy blazer, not the polo. She told me not to mention the truck. She told me not to bring up property management because, and I'm quoting here, nobody at that table is going to want to hear about tenants and leases. I didn't say much. I put on the navy blazer. I showed up, and she seated me at the end of the table, the farthest seat from the center of conversation, between Judge Reddy's wife, who was perfectly pleasant but quiet, and Priya's younger brother Marcus, who shook my hand, asked what I did, said, "Oh, cool," when I said property management, and then looked at his phone for the rest of the meal. Sandra introduced me when Judge Reddy arrived and made his way around greeting everyone. "This is my husband, Mike. He's in property management. Quick, flat, move on." The judge smiled at me, nodded, and moved on to the next person. I ate my food. I kept my mouth shut. I watched Sandra light up across the table, animated, laughing, leaning in when the judge spoke, performing every single polished version of herself she'd been rehearsing for years. I ordered the fish. I drank one glass of wine. I watched the candles. But what happened next completely changed everything. The judge stood up about an hour into dinner and tapped his glass. He said he wanted to say a few words. He thanked Garrett and Priya. He thanked his wife. He walked slowly around the table, and one by one he acknowledged each guest with something personal, a shared memory, a word of thanks. He was working his way toward my end of the table. He got to Marcus, said something kind. He got to the judge's wife and kissed her on the cheek. And then he got to me. He stopped. His smile didn't just shift, it disappeared, and something else replaced it. Not coldness, more like recognition mixed with disbelief. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you run into them completely out of context, and your brain takes a second to catch up. He said my last name, not Mike, my full last name, like a question. I nodded. He looked at me for another few seconds, and then he turned to the table, to Sandra, specifically, and he said it. "Do they know who you really are?" The table went silent. Not conversation paused silent. Stopped breathing silent. Sandra's face drained. She had this frozen smile, the practiced one, and underneath it I could see the confusion and the beginning of something close to panic. I said quietly, "Judge, we don't need to get into that tonight." And he said, "No, I think we do. I need to slow down here for a second because I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment." I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't thinking, "Here it comes, she's going to get what she deserves." That's not how I'm wired. What I actually felt was something closer to grief, because I realized that whatever the judge was about to say was going to permanently change the landscape of my marriage, and I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for that. 18 years is a long time. We had built things together. A home. A life. We didn't have children. That's a separate chapter, but we had Christmases and hospital waiting rooms and late nights arguing about taxes and lazy Sunday mornings that I still think about sometimes. None of that disappears just because one person has been slowly diminishing the other without fully recognizing what they're doing. I looked at Sandra across that table and I thought, she didn't know. And that's the most complicated part. She genuinely didn't know. She had married a man with a truck and a modest business, and she had constructed a story around that. An embarrassing husband, an underperforming husband, a husband who needed to be managed at social events, and she had never once asked the right questions to know if the story was still accurate, or if it had ever been fair. Because the truth is, I hadn't told her everything, and that was on me. I kept the scope of the business private for so long that I had accidentally let her operate on outdated information. I was so busy protecting my peace and being quietly annoyed at her condescension that I never stopped to think, she literally doesn't know. And that was about to end. I thought that was the worst part, the silence, the frozen smiles, the stares. But what came next was something I'll never forget. Judge Reddy sat down and leaned forward. He looked at Sandra and said, calmly, like a man who has been in courtrooms for 30 years and knows how to fill silence with precision. About 4 years ago, my office had a situation with a real estate holding that had been mismanaged. We were trying to unwind a commercial lease on a strip in Henrico County. It was complicated and it was costing us. A colleague referred me to your husband. He paused. Mike handled it in 10 days. 10 days. He came in, understood the structure better than the attorney we'd retained, and resolved a situation that had been dragging on for 8 months. He didn't charge us what he should have. He didn't make a production of it. He just fixed it. And then he referred us to 3 other holdings we didn't know we had exposure on. He looked at me. I made some calls after that. About you. I like to know who I'm dealing with. He said what he'd found, quietly, not to show off, but like he was correcting the record. 400-plus residential units. Commercial holdings. The warehouse stake. A reputation in regional real estate circles that, apparently, was not small. He said, Mike, I believe you're probably the most successful businessman at this table. And based on what I'm hearing tonight, it sounds like your wife may not know that. There's a sound I can only describe as the room renegotiating itself. Marcus put his phone down. Garrett, my brother-in-law, stared at me. Sandra sat completely still. She looked like someone who had just been handed a document that contradicted everything she'd signed her name to. And the judge, this federal judge who owed me nothing, who I had met one time 4 years earlier, looked at her not unkindly and said, the man you keep at the end of the table is the most interesting one in the room. I want to tell you what Sandra did. She didn't cry. She didn't get defensive, at least not right there. She sat in a kind of stillness I'd never seen from her before, and she looked at me across the length of that table, past the candles, past the wine glasses, past all the people she'd invited to witness what she thought was her best self, and I saw it in her eyes. She understood, not just the financial piece. That part almost didn't matter. She understood the larger thing, the 18 years of dinner table placements and careful introductions and something like that, and don't talk about work. She saw all of it from the outside for maybe the first time, reflected back at her through the expression on every other face at the table. Nobody at that dinner said a word, but they were all making the same quiet recalculation. On the drive home, she was quiet for almost 20 minutes. I drove. The truck. The blue F-250 with the rust on the door. I let the silence be what it was. Finally, she said, you never told me. I said, you never asked. And then she said something that surprised me. She said, "That's not a defense. That's an accusation." She was right. And I told her so. But here's what I didn't see coming. The next few months were not clean. I want to be honest about that. This isn't a story where one dinner fixes a marriage, or where the bad person learns their lesson and everyone lives happily ever after. Life doesn't work that way, and I respect you too much to pretend it does. Sandra and I went to counseling. A good counselor, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who had zero interest in letting either of us off the hook. She pointed out, quickly, that I had contributed to the dynamic as much as Sandra had. I had chosen invisibility. I had withheld information as a form of self-protection that also happened to be a form of control. I had let resentment build instead of asking for what I needed. That was on me. And Sandra had to look hard at what she'd done, not just the social staging, but the deeper thing. Why had she needed to manage me? Why had my success in a field she deemed unglamorous been something to minimize rather than celebrate? She had to ask herself some uncomfortable questions about what she actually valued and whether the person she'd become at those fundraisers and charity dinners was someone she recognized. Those conversations were hard. A lot of them ended badly. But here's what happened in the meantime. Priya, the soon-to-be sister-in-law, called me 2 weeks after the dinner. She had a development question, a family property thing, and she asked if I'd take a look. I did. Simple matter. But she mentioned it to her father. The judge emailed me the following month with a referral. A colleague of his who needed consulting on a property portfolio that was tangled up in an estate. Good work, good client. 4 hours of my time. That turned into 2 more referrals. Garrett, Sandra's brother, took me to lunch and told me he'd had no idea. He said he'd always thought of me as a quiet guy who didn't make waves, and he was sorry he'd never asked more questions. We've been closer since then than we'd been in 15 years of being family. And Sandra's social circle, the one that had been a place where I was the slightly embarrassing husband in the wrong jacket, slowly found out. These things travel. At the next charity gala Sandra attended, the woman who ran the foundation asked Sandra if she could be introduced to her husband in real estate because they were looking for someone to consult on a building they were considering purchasing. Sandra called me that night from the event. "Someone here wants to meet you," she said. There was something in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Not quite pride, but something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like she was seeing me clearly, maybe for the first time. I said I'd be happy to take a meeting. And I asked her, carefully, "Do you want me to come pick you up after? I've got the truck." She laughed, just a little. And then she said, "Yeah, come get me. I don't want to wrap this up too neatly, because the truth is we're still in the middle of it. Sandra and I are still married. We're in a better place than we've been in years. But we're also different than we were. You can't unsee what that dinner put in front of us. What I know is this. The work we've done since, the counseling, the hard conversations, the choosing each day to show up for each other honestly, that's harder than anything I did to build the business. Business problems have solutions. People are more complicated. She told me once, in a session with Patricia, that she had been afraid. Not of me, but what I represented. She'd come from a family where the way people measured you was visible. Credentials, titles, positions. Her mother was a college administrator. Her father was a physician. Success in her family looked a specific way, and she'd married a man in work boots who didn't fit the picture, and somewhere along the way she started managing that dissonance by making me smaller instead of expanding her definition of what mattered. That was a hard thing for her to say out loud. I know it cost her something to say it, and I gave her credit for it. I told her I'd made myself invisible for too long. That there was a version of what happened where I'd simply showed up as my full self from the beginning. Not to show off, but because I trusted her, and maybe we'd have skipped a decade of quiet resentment. I'll never know. What I know is where we are now. And I know what Judge Reddy did for us at that dinner table. I've thought about that moment 100 times since. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. The judge didn't do what he did to embarrass Sandra. He's too smart and too decent for that. I think he saw a man being made invisible in front of his eyes and decided, in a way that people who have real authority sometimes can, to simply tell the truth. He saw me in a room full of people performing for each other. He saw me clearly and chose to say so. I think about how rarely that happens. How often we walk into rooms and immediately take stock of who has the obvious power, the title, the money, the suit, the voice that carries, and we organize ourselves around that. We seat people accordingly. We introduce people accordingly. We decide, in seconds, who is worth listening to and who is background noise. And we are wrong so much more often than we admit. The person you underestimate at the dinner party might be the most quietly accomplished one in the room. The woman you pass over in a meeting might be the one who sees the solution none of you noticed. The man in the truck who doesn't talk much might have spent 15 years building something real while you were polishing your image. I don't say this to make myself sound important. I say it because I've been on both sides of this. I've been the one underestimated. And I've also, in my life, been the one who didn't look close enough at someone else. I don't say this to make myself sound important. I say it because I've been on both sides of this. I've been the one underestimated. And I've also, in my life, been the one who didn't look close enough at someone else. I've made the mistake too. What the judge gave me that night wasn't justice or revenge. Those words are too dramatic for what actually happened. What he gave me was visibility. A moment of being truly seen in a room full of people who had already decided I wasn't worth seeing. And what that dinner gave Sandra wasn't humiliation. It was information. Information she should have had for years, some of which I should have given her, and some of which she should have thought to ask for. We're both still learning. The truck's still in the driveway. Still has the rust on the door. I haven't fixed it on purpose. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. If you've been sitting at the end of someone's table, written off, minimized, quietly moved aside. I just want to tell you, keep going, keep building, keep being exactly who you are without needing anyone to validate it. Because the truth has a way of standing up on its own. Sometimes it just needs someone with the courage to say it out loud. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, you know what to do.